Everyone, welcome to an exciting shelfie edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I'm loving the bookshelf behind my guest on this episode. Delighted to be talking with author, comics creator Trevor Mueller. Trevor, thank you for jumping in and agreeing to chat with me for a few minutes.
Thank you so much for reaching out and finding me. This is going to be, I think, a very enjoyable conversation.
Yes, agreed, agreed. I mentioned before I started recording that you have a wonderful range of works. I'm going to name drop a few titles here, and you're welcome to throw any in that you'd like to add. But Albert the Alien might be one of the
Mhm.
most prominent titles that folks out there know you for. You've also created in the world of web comics with Nexus Point. And then there is a new project, which is a little different than those two, and that is Los Ojos.
hmm Yeah.
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 You and I, again, were talking before we hit the record button, but essentially, like, I like variety. Variety is
Mhm.
the slice of life. And as somebody who has a lot of different passion points and probably trickling into my ADD a little bit here, right? Like, it's very easy for me to jump around to different types of projects. I also like to challenge myself. And so writing kids comics is very different than writing comics for adults and grown-ups. It's very different than writing a vertical scroll comic like Nexus Point on a
Mhm.
site like
Mhm.
Webtoon, which is more of like a PG 13, right? It's like a young adult, is what I would describe it as. And so I like to flex multiple muscles. I like to try to do new things and challenge myself to try new types of storytelling. This year, I'm even trying to teach myself how to write movies, and then
Nice, nice.
I might dip my toe into the novel writing, genre a little bit. So not genre, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But so I like to do something different. And Albert was, I think, kind of my first introduction to long form storytelling in a professional setting. I'd been doing it much longer than that. And I really enjoyed what we were able to do with that character, and the audiences that we've connected with have been so inspiring, because young readers crave something to read, a character that they can identify with. And a character like Albert is a first foreign exchange student from outer space. And I feel like at some point in our lives, we've all felt like an alien
Hmm.
among our
Hmm.
peers and in life in general. And so readers really resonated with Albert, and especially among my educator friends who work with special needs kids and kids that are on the spectrum. Like, they really identify with Albert too, because he's from another planet. He doesn't pick up on social cues. He doesn't understand necessarily all the societal norms. There are things that he doesn't necessarily pick up on, but he still has fun adventures with his friends all the time. And so the idea is that it doesn't matter where you are, who you are, you can still have fun and go on these kinds of adventures. And again, I always thought that was a very positive message to put out into the world.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that, and it definitely rings for an educator to hear that as well. That resonates for sure. At what point did you know that storytelling was going to be something that you wanted to do? It sounds like there's some reader roots that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I have always loved storytelling. I think growing up, I grew up on a lot of movies and TV shows, as one did in the 80s and 90s. And it at the time, technology was not as accessible to make those types of stories. It wasn't until high school and college where I finally started to get my hands on like cameras and editing equipment and those types of things, because digital editing wasn't a thing. People
Hmm.
didn't have
Hmm.
cameras in their pockets that could record hours of video. It you needed specialized equipment to do it on. But comics were a very easy way and a very inexpensive way to tell a visual story. And so for me, I could draw on lined pieces of paper and just kind of make up a character and tell an adventure as short or as long as I wanted to. In high school, I had created a character called the Defender of Food.
Hmm.
It was my first and only superhero story I've ever written, but it's essentially about a kid who decides that their niche in life is going to be defending food. Like, aliens come and abduct Earth's supply of children and chocolate. He goes and saves the chocolate because somebody else is going to go save those kids. And I thought that that was kind of fun and funny and unique and interesting. And it was very inexpensive for me to make. Now, I never came up with mass distribution. We never came up with a publication plan. none of those things had ever occurred to me. It was just something I made for me or my friends, or occasionally scribbled on my math homework, and the teachers would give me extra math homework because they wanted to know what happened next. So it was just this kind of fun and funny thing to do. When I went to college is when I stopped doing storytelling for like 2 years, because at that point, I was paying to be there. I was like, oh, maybe I should pay attention. And so really kind of focused on my grades. And after 2 years in college, I had a couple of friends that started up on this thing called web comics, because web comics were new and really had kind of launched on individual sites. There weren't collectives of sites like there are now with Webtoon and Tapas. And so the community was very fledgling and very fragmented. But when
Mhm.
you could find these places where people gravitated towards, there was a very strong knit community.
Mhm.
And some friends of mine were doing a jam comic. So one artist writes and draws a page, and then somebody draws and writes the next page, and we're all kind of working together to tell one coherent story as much as we can. We always had one guy in there that would always throw us a curveball, and we were like, "Come on, man, seriously." But that got me reignited in my love of storytelling, and at that point, I started launching two web comic series. One of which I didn't know anything about the art and the digital specs and those things for like making comics, and especially not doing them in print. So one of them can never see the light of print, but that was like a samurai sci-fi story called The Temple of a Thousand Tears. It was very edgy, right? Because I was in college. And then the other one has a naughty word in the title because I was listening to way too much Dennis Leary at the time. Um, and I ended up self-publishing that comic as kind of a gag strip story. And that became my first self publishing. So my career really started off with, yes, drawing on lined pieces of paper, but then started off on the web, which again had distribution, but didn't necessarily have the costs associated with creating any kind of physical copy or mass distribution of a physical product. And
Yeah.
then we ended up self publishing those books, which to me kind of became my stepping stone into the world of publishing and the world of indie comics. And I've just
Nice,
been doing it ever
nice.
since.
Love it, love it. Well, when you're coming up with ideas and going through these phases, I'm curious about um, any particular parts of the writing and creating process that you'd like to mention, as well as the vision, because as I said at the beginning, and as we've talked, you have a nice range to what you're creating.
Yeah, I like to. I mean, I go to a lot of conventions, not as many as I used to, because I got kids now. But back in the day, I was hitting like 15, 18 conventions a year, and I was usually a guest at all these shows. I thankfully had a couple of guys that were mentoring me and helping me to get in on the guest ticket, which kept costs down. And with the shows and stuff that I was doing, I would do panels and workshops and stuff to try to help that next generation. So the things that I was learning, I would try to pass those on so that the same hurdles I encountered, those people would not necessarily have to encounter those same hurdles. When you talk about writing, I mean, the good thing about writing is there's no one right way to do it.
Hmm.
But I very much fall into the school of learn by doing. And so I always encourage people, like, you can read as many textbooks as you want, you can attend as many classes as you want until you sit down and actually start writing a book, a screenplay, a comic book script, whatever it is. You're not going to learn what it is. And so the advice I always give to people is start with something short. Because starting with a short story, one, I think writing short stories is harder than
Hmm.
writing a longer story. Two, you really got to watch yourself on pacing and story beats, which are really, really important. And we can expand on that in a little bit. Three, if you're like me and you're just a writer, you have to go out and you have to find an artist. And it's a
Hmm.
lot easier to find an artist and somebody that you want to work with for 8 pages than it is to have somebody work with you for like 500 pages,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's a commitment, right? It's
Yes.
the joke I always make is when you first meet somebody that you're interested in dating, do you immediately say, "Will you marry me?" Or do you say, "I would like, would you like to go out for coffee with me?" And for me, the short story is the equivalent of going out for coffee,
Hmm. Hmm.
because 200-page story, like a graphic novel, like 200-page book, that's going to take a year or two to put together. That's not a short-term commitment. And for
Yeah,
somebody that you've only just met, you don't know if you get along. You don't know if you jive creatively. You don't know if they're even going to finish the project. You don't know if they can hit their
yeah.
deadlines. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong there. And so it allows you to kind of test the waters. But the other reason why I really like working with short stories too is I can juggle a lot of them at the same time to diversify what kind of stories I'm working on, and to find different kind of artists that are out there. I work with artists from all over the world. My Nexus Point artist is from Barcelona. My
Mhm.
Repossessed artist on Webtoon lives in China. I've worked with a guy that lives over in Taiwan. I work with a lot of Italians for some reason. um, and yeah, people from the States and from Canada and Latin America and stuff too. But like the main projects I'm working on right now seem to gyrate within those areas of the world for some reason. That's just where I'm finding the artists. But the last thing and the most important thing too is that it gets you into the habit of finishing, because you're much more likely to finish like an 8 or a 10 page story than you are to finish that 200-page story. Usually what happens is people get to page 10 and then they go back and reread what they wrote and they're like, oh, this stinks. I can do it better. Well, of course it
Right.
stinks. You just wrote 10 pages and you've started to figure out what's your narrative voice, what's your pacing, how's your style transferring onto the script or onto the page. You have started to learn by doing. And I adhere to a saying that I shamelessly steal from one of my friends. If you look back on work that you did a year ago and you still think it's good, you haven't grown enough. And it's not
Mhm.
that that work was bad, it's that you've just gotten better because you kept doing it. And
Mhm.
if you go
Mhm.
back and rewrite those 10 pages, you're never going to finish that 200-page story. If you write a 10-page story and you want to go back and rewrite it, like you can make another version, you can make a director's cut, you can do right whatever you want to do with it. But that also, sorry, I guess there's one more point to why to work short too. Once you finish that story, once you get into that habit of finishing a story, the cost to print that shorter story is a lot cheaper
Mhm.
than it is if you're printing a 200-page graphic novel. And so it's a lot easier to get that thing printed, and then you have a physical product that you can hold in your hand and hand to an editor and say, hey, here's an example of the kind of stuff that I do. Or you can hand it to another artist or a collaborator of some kind and say, this is an example of what I do. Would you like to work together? And it can
Mhm.
become a
Mhm.
networking piece. And I think that that's something that's very much overlooked. I think it's very easy for people to sit there and say, well, I've got a digital portfolio. Well, that's cool if they're looking for someone. But if they're not looking for someone, if it's not a pull method, if it's a push method to try to get a collaborator, then you need to have what's readily available. And it's
Mhm.
hard to ignore a physical book in their hand, especially if you're giving it away for free, right?
Yeah,
So
totally.
I don't know that I necessarily answered your question. So apologies there. But
No,
I
that's
will say,
great.
like, so like this is how I kind of got started with my writing, right? Like Albert the Alien started off as a short story for the Reading with Pictures anthology, which is an
Mhm.
educational nonprofit. My buddy Josh Elder started it. And I was their marketing director for a number of years. And their mission was to get comics into schools and libraries around the world. And Josh's idea was essentially that images and words combined together with a narrative focus can help kids absorb information faster
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
longer periods of time and in a way that is more enjoyable and they are less resistant to
Mhm.
than if it is in a textbook environment. And so we created two graphic novels. The second one was published by Andrews McMeel. The first one we funded on Kickstarter and just did ourselves. Jill Thompson was involved. Raina Telgemeier was involved. I mean, we had huge names involved in this book. And that's where Albert started because he found me an artist that at the time was just doing coloring. Nobody
Mhm.
would take a chance on this guy to do illustration. And I sent him a one sentence description. You know, Albert the Alien is a seventh grade student from another planet. Have
Mhm.
fun. And he sent me back like 7 designs, and one of them he did 3 times and colored that one. And I was like, huh, I wonder
Wow.
which design he likes the best.
Right. Right.
And so for me, so we started off short with Albert, and then again we did like 2 or 3 short stories with him. And at that point, we were out of the coffee phase, and I was like, hey, do you want to spend the next 6 years of your life working on an 800-page story with me? And he was like, I do. And so, we did that, but we had the physical books, the single issue books, and we handed those over to like Mark Wade. Mark Wade was at a signing over in Chicago, and I had an introduction to him and just said, hey, here's an example of the kind of stuff I'm doing. Is this the kind of stuff you might be interested in doing? At the time, he was launching Thrillbent, his online webcomic site.
Mhm.
And he was like, yeah, let me check it out. And he emailed me from the plane after having read the books. And he was like, I would be very interested in having this on my website. And so we uploaded through Mark Wade's Thrillbent website.
Nice.
We self-published 4 graphic novels over the course of 6 years, and we got nominated for 2 Harvey Awards for the series. So starting short may not feel as attractive and fun to some creators because they've got this big magnum opus story in their heads, right? And the
Yeah.
joke that I always make is, yeah, but it's just in your head. And right now you're kind of like sitting in a bubble bath of ideas, right? Like it's
Hmm.
warm, it's comfortable, it's perfect. It's when you get out of the bathtub and you realize the towel is scratchy, or the floor is cold, or the air is stinky. And it's the equivalent of sitting down and looking at that blank page and saying, what is the story that I want to tell? Who are these characters? And it's a lot easier to do in a short story, especially if you are first starting out, than it is if you're trying to sit down and write your big magnum opus that you will be known for, right? The great
Right.
American novel, if you will. Um, because the chances are you're not going to finish that book.
Yeah.
I don't
And
want to
I
discourage people, but it's just the likelihood is not in your favor.
but I'm always amazed and appreciative of people that do the magnum opus, they have the thing, but then they love the form so much they continue to write shorter works too
Mhm.
and explore that way.
I still do that today. I mean, I have anthology pieces that I'll pitch all the
Hmm.
time. Sometimes I like to just have short stories on hand if I want to test out a new artist. We might print it, we might not. You know, it might be something that my newsletter subscribers get to read only. It might go on my Patreon.
Yeah.
Um, but it's an opportunity to kind of test the waters a little bit. And there's been a few artists that I've worked with that, you know, were flaky and I wasn't able to continue a relationship with them, unfortunately. And that just happens.
Hmm.
Life happens, right? But thankfully, the bulk of the people that I have found and through this process have kind of nurtured a relationship with, you know, they really enjoy working with me and I really enjoy working with them. I will say, you know, one of the joys of working in comics is the collaborative nature of it versus like novels, which are a lot more solitary.
Hmm.
Um, and every time I get an email from one of my artists, I mean, it's like it's your birthday and you're opening up a present. You know, like it's because you had this vision in your head of what a thing was going to look like. You wrote it all out. You put your blood, sweat, and tears into this thing, and then suddenly you get to see it
Hmm.
visually in
Hmm.
front of you, and it's just such a joy. And so again, I get to do that with multiple artists on multiple projects at the same time, and again against a variety of genres, as you mentioned earlier. And so it, but it all has the same reaction. It all has that same dopamine release
Hmm.
as a
Hmm.
creator, if you will. And it's a real pleasure to be able to do that, and to be able to continue to do that throughout my career. I had a last point I'll make is I had a friend who, when I was first starting out, I was tabling next to him. He'd gotten me a guest spot as my first convention. I had one little 54-page black and white comic book on my table with the naughty title. And I looked at him. I was like, man, is there a better feeling than like putting your blood, sweat, and tears into making a story and like being able to hold a physical copy of it in your hand? And he goes, yes, there is. Seeing that same book in somebody else's hand while they are waiting in line to get you to sign it because they want to buy it from you. And he was not wrong. Like it's a wonderful feeling. It's the reason why I keep doing this stuff is for those fans, for those readers, for the kids that come up to me with their own pictures of Albert the Alien or who have
Mm.
made like this is Albert the Alien's aquatic outfit. We never had an underwater adventure for Albert the Alien. So suddenly they're telling their own adventures with
Yeah.
Albert the Alien. And it has sparked and inspired that imagination that, you know, the comic books I used to read on the spinner racks or the stories that I used to watch as a kid that inspired me through the amalgamations in my head as they go in there, right, to tell my own stories. They've read this story and it has given them that same spark. And again, very positive feeling. It's like warming your wrapping yourself in a nice warm blanket.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, on the reader side, it's great to find a story that you connect with. It's great to find that voice out there and the images that are just the thing that you're looking for. So it's just win-win, win-win.
100%.
Yeah. So I'm curious about the book that is on the way, Los Ojos, and I'm also
Mm-hmm.
curious about where people can go to learn more about your writing and creating.
Yeah, for sure. I'll answer the second question first. Trevor A. Mueller is my website, my Instagram, my Facebook, my TikTok, my my everything. Find me, follow me, friend me. Trevor A. Mueller. I have a newsletter at trevoramueller.com. that you can sign up for. It comes out monthly. I don't spam you. I don't have time to do it more often. During the crowdfunding, it might come out a little bit more often, but it's like a quick one, just like, hey, in case you missed it, crowdfunding things going on. But the book that I just finished and that's up available right now on Zoop is called Los Ojos. It's a horror action graphic novel. It's
Mhm.
not my first horror story, but it's my first long form horror story. But it's kind of like John Wick meets John Constantine, right? Like there's a lot of action in there, but there's some supernatural monsters and things that this guy's fighting. But it's a story about a hitman named Andre Sanchez who wakes up one day to discover that he has this magical ability when he looks people in the eyes, los ojos, he doesn't see them as human. He sees them as angels or demons.
Mhm.
And he believes that demons are disguising themselves as people and they walk among us, and he's the only one that can see their true self. And he's on this crusade to rid the world of evil. It's in the first chapter that he realizes he sees something that he's never seen before, and he realizes that what he is seeing, his binary view of the world, may not be true. And so
Right.
suddenly everything's kind of thrown upside down. And when I write characters, when I write story, I always like to think about like what's kind of a cool setup and a cool concept, and then how do I throw curveballs at this character? How do I really keep them on their toes? Because to me,
Mhm.
that's very entertaining to read, and as a writer, it's very entertaining to write. I
Mhm.
don't want to be able to predict what happens next. And when we had early reviews for Los Ojos, the first chapter come out, we had this one review came out with like, I liked it. It was really good. I knew where it was going until I didn't.
Nice. Nice.
And he's like, and then I had to go back and I realized, oh yes, he has peppered all of those little tidbits throughout. And he's like, and suddenly this book became like a whole nother level. It's like an onion, right? You just kind of keep peeling back the layers of it. But Los Ojos, I mean, I originally wrote the first 25 pages of this as a short story, a single issue, one and done, because I was testing out a new artist,
Mhm.
Francisco Iaquinta. And we gotten it published through a publisher that doesn't exist anymore. The guy shut down operations and decided he wanted to go make movies instead. So we got the rights back, and it was designed to be like a single issue one and done story, but left open with a little bit of a cliffhanger, right? Like, could there
Mhm.
be a potential sequel to this? And I had ideas, but I didn't have anything strong enough to sit there and say I wanted to do like another story just yet. But I kept in touch with Francisco, and so he and I, 6, 7 years, kind of going back and forth, coming up with things. Our lives changed. I had kids,
Mhm.
um, and it was when that happened that I was like, wait a minute, like, what do you do with this person who sees the world in binary terms, right? Good and evil.
Uh-huh.
And you suddenly throw in a kid who, let's face it, is chaotic neutral, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
not evil, but can put stress on somebody who's not prepared for that situation. And for somebody who is an assassin by nature, like Andre says, who needs to be in peak physical and mental shape and capacity, well, suddenly if he's not sleeping all the way through the night because the kid's got nightmares or wants to crawl into bed and go to sleep, or if Andres is trying to prep for, like read a dossier and suddenly the kid's like, I need mac and cheese, and he's making mac and cheese. This isn't the way mommy made it, right? Like all
Right.
those things that this guy's not ready to deal with. How does that start to affect his performance? How does that start to affect his worldview? How does that start to change and evolve him as a character? And I thought that
Mhm.
those were fun and interesting questions to ask. So, long answer to a short question, like this is kind of like what we did with Los Ojos. Like, yes, it's a fun story about a guy with guns shooting demons, but it's also got this human element and this human story injected into it as well that hopefully gives it a couple more layers and a little bit more depth and makes the characters a little bit more well-rounded.
Mhm.
Which,
Mhm.
with Albert, everything was very surface. Like the characters don't really change.
Yeah.
Albert is the same in issue one as he is in the final issue that we wrote. Andres undergoes a journey. He undergoes an arc. And to me, that was a fun new muscle to try to flex. And one of the reasons why I keep leaning in towards that variety that you mentioned in
Yeah.
terms of the stories that I tell and the kind of offerings that I do.
Yeah.
So
Love it. Love it.
hopefully that
I
answers the question.
absolutely, and love the fascinating angle, and I love how thoughtful you are in unfolding the story, and as you said, peppering those things in to keep the reader on their toes.
Yeah. And I will say to anyone who wants to get a copy of Albert the Alien, you can order Albert the Alien through the Zoop campaign for Los Ojos, which helps to contribute towards the Zoop campaign funding. It is also available on my website at trevoramueller.com. Either of those, I can personalize the book and sign it for you. If you get it through Amazon, it comes out of a warehouse. I can't do anything for you there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will, of course, share the Zoop link as well as your website link in the video and audio. Have we missed anything in the talk through that you want to make sure to mention before we close out?
No, I mean, I would say to any of your fans and viewers that are thinking about making a story or are struggling with making a story, the thing that I would say is just go make it. Like
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
doesn't matter if it's good. It doesn't matter if it's uh, done with photographs. I did a comic book with photographs. If it's stick figures, I mean, there's so many comics out there done with stick figures that find an audience and that make money.
Hmm.
Um, but tell your story. Like that's the most important part at the end of the day is whatever that story is, whatever has inspired you to want to tell this story, sit down and do it.
Yeah.
I go to at least half a dozen conventions now, but I used to do almost 20 conventions a year for 12 odd some years, 15 years that I've been doing this. And I always put down a challenge in one of my writers' workshops, which is I'll be back at this convention again next year. And if you have written something, you've got that time to write one thing and come up to me and show it to me. And in all the years that I've been doing this, the number just went up to 8
Wow. Wow.
as
Yeah.
of like February. So if you can do it, if you can sit down and just write a short story, again, 8, 10 pages, whatever it is, you're so far ahead of everyone else out there that is thinking about or aspiring to be or wants to be a writer
Mm-hmm.
who will just sit in that bubble bath of ideas and never get out of the tub.
Awesome. Awesome. Very well said. And a wonderful note to close on. Trevor, glad to have you back anytime to talk about comics and creating. And I appreciate your time and work very much.
Jason, thank you so much, man. This was a really fun conversation.